I want to do something that's not often done. I would like to give the Iranian perspective, at least from the standpoint of the political perspective. And I understand in saying this that it is impossible to nail down every aspect of a society to which you do not exist in. But except for the most part, they're human beings. And as human beings, there are certain drives that we tend to share that, at least over the context of history, those drives tend to find themselves throughout societies, despite the overlay of some kind of religious or ideological thing. So I think for the most part, you can come to some kind of idea on their perspective, and I want to share their perspective because I think oftentimes an American audience doesn't necessarily think of things in these terms. They think of things almost in one-dimensional terms, and the world doesn't work that way. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is Soapbox After Dark. Welcome to the show. I'm not going to keep you long on this video, but I do want to talk about this, and I didn't want to go too long into it on the last video. And I just want to share a few points, and I'm going to try to go through the points relatively quickly. But the first one is the Iranian perspective, politically the Iranian perspective. Our countries may be different in the sense of how the countries are shaped, how they're worked, how they're put together. But ultimately, they're still based within the context of a political system. And it gets a certain degree of legitimacy, meaning the political system has the legitimacy based on the public. Regardless of what you think of their government, it is their government. And in the same way we have our political struggles in this country, in the same way they had their struggles in the UK, in Europe, with kings and queens, and you had a parliament pushing back against the kings and queens. Iran is going to have its struggles. It's going to have its fights and everything else. It is not for us to impose our will upon them within the context of their struggles any more than any other country to impose their will upon us in the context of ours. The moderates in Iran made the decision to go with the JCPOA after nearly a decade, I think it was more than a decade, of negotiations. That deal was seen as a thing to stop a war. It literally was during that time, because I remember focusing on that because that was the talk. There was a notion, this thought, that the United States was careening to a war with Iran, and that this deal was a thing to stop that particular war. All of the countries around the world co-signed it. Everybody says yes. And I'm not even going back to the coups that took place that the United States and the UK were involved in from the standpoint of Iran. And this anger, righteously, might I add, that they have at the United States in the context of that. We put in a brutal dictator in that country over the context of years. We've been bitching at Russia for a year about a Russia hacking thing. We have literally put in a brutal, bloodthirsty dictator within their country. If anybody should be pissed off, it should be them. And nevertheless, we have had this grudge against regime change. It's like when we turn over a government, we want that regime to stick. Well, it did. And what was a democratic country to some degree ends up being a religious theocracy. However, it is their religious theocracy, which is my point. It's not for us. It's not for us. They have their struggles. Now, my point is this. It was the moderates in that country that was able to get this deal through. They took a moderate point of view. They agreed, yes, we're not trying to get nuclear weapons, and if this gets you off our back, fine. But you understand there were hardliners in that country that hated this deal, that thought this deal went far too far in regards to trespassing within the context of their own sovereignty. Iran is a sovereign country. What right is it for the United States to tell it that it can't have nuclear technology? What right is it for any other country to tell it that it can't set or the limits to which it can get nuclear technology in regards to fuel or in regards to even weapons for that matter? Israel has nuclear weapons. Nobody cares about that. They care about Iran's. Let's just be very clear that this is not in the context of right and wrong or fair and unfair. This is in the context of power. However, this argument is put in a sense of the reasons why it's okay for the U.S. and for European powers to impose their will in this way. We've invaded countries. Iran hasn't invaded anybody. They haven't invaded anybody. My point is this. This is an issue of power. Regardless of the language that's used, the issue here is power. The hardliners in that country lost. The deal went through. The next president comes in office, gets rid of the deal. And not just gets rid of the deal, goes on a spree for years, outright, belligerently attacking the country, and starts taking provocative steps after pulling out of the deal. Meaning not just ratcheting up sanctions, but also ratcheting up the rhetoric. We will destroy you. All of these nasty tweets that is absolutely shows somewhat of a depraved indifference to the office of the presidency, or at the very least any notion of dignity within the office of the presidency. But that's what was taking place. Now, Iran, in this case, the moderates look like assholes. Because you've pulled out of a deal that the rest of the world said was good. And not just pulled out of the deal, you did so in this way of almost in somewhat of a laughing at the fact that they made the deal in the first place and said the deal was horrible and so forth. What are the moderates to do in this case? They have no room. They have no leeway. You've made them look sad and pathetic. In fact, not just made them look sad and pathetic, you've, to some degree, validated everything that the hardliners in the country was saying about it. And now you want another deal. Where's your leeway in that case? If you're in the Iranian government, where's your leeway? Who in that government is going to say, yes, let's have a conversation with the President of the United States again after he pulled out of the letter? Nobody. That government, yes, may completely depend on Khomeini in regards to the final say-so, but it's still a government in regards to the way the processes act. And in that case, there is nobody in that process that is willing to take that on. Meaning it doesn't matter how much Trump bellyaches. There is nobody on the other end of that telephone call that can pick up that call. The only way for any conversation to take place is for Trump to get back into the JCPOA. That is the only starting point. Up to that point, there is no leeway for this to work from the Iranian perspective. And if it was you, you would not think any differently. There is no country on this planet that would behave any differently. It's a sovereign nation. It is a proud sovereign nation. And any nation that is a spine will behave in such ways. That's the first point. Second point, history. So history is not this thing that takes place in the past. It's not, oftentimes we look at history as if these static people that were so distant from us. But they weren't. They were just like us. They had their own drives and wants and needs. They needed food, clothing, shelter, and all this other stuff. And when you could see a year before the First World War, they didn't see it coming. Like, when you look at the things that they were talking about, they didn't see it coming. Not just didn't see it coming, it wasn't even important news. When Archduke was shot, to us, we find that as being a momentous thing. But we're looking at this from the context of history, not from the context of their time. In their time, they did not see it as a big deal. The events escalated within the context of bam, in no time. You can look at the newspapers, and it was like a footnote. And then events started to one after the next, in which case there's going to be a war. There's not going to be a war. There's going to be a war. There's not going to be a war. And from their perspective, many of the things that could have been wars were averted leading up to that point. So the public didn't necessarily see this as a huge deal. It became an extraordinarily big deal. My point is this. History is not this thing that takes place entirely in the past. It is a living thing. And you can look back at the trends and the way people were behaving back then. And you can look at things, and back then you would say, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't inevitable. There were choices that people were making in those situations. And in this very specific one, it is us. We, again, God damn it, are the aggressors in this particular conflict. We are the aggressors. Third point. The JCPOA technically is not dead. Technically, the JCPOA is not dead. When I write software is logic. It's very straightforward in what it is. If I tell something to do something, it does that very specific thing. There's some fuzzy stuff, but for the most part, just basic logic. Human speech is not necessarily that way. We say things, and we have all sorts of connotations built into the things that we say. My understanding of something may be different than yours, even though we're hearing the exact same sentence, because what we're hearing is being filtered through all of the experiences that are you, and those things are going to be different than what is me. My point is, when you're writing law, it's the same way. Law is interpreted. So when they're writing the JCPOA, depending on interpretations of the JCPOA is not dead. And because all of this stuff is just the view of a particular party, meaning the Iranian view is no less than the American view or no less than the British view, you may have things that are objectively true or false in those points of view, but it is their point of view. And if they're talking about the law itself, the point of view can sustain itself just based on the fact that it's a point of view. I hope that makes sense. The Iranian point of view is, we haven't pulled out of the JCPOA. There's provisions within the JCPOA that allow us to pull back on certain provisions that we are doing if other parties are not holding their obligations. And the United States clearly is not upholding its obligations. And since everybody else in this group say that we were living up to our obligations, then it's on them. We've not pulled out. This provision says we can dial back some elements when other people aren't living up to their end. That's their point of view. And that's the point of view that they've taken. Now, Europe appreciates this point of view because Europe's point of view is, we want to keep this deal in place. Now, Macron is having a conversation with Rouhani, and these guys are saying, look, we want to keep this deal in place. We want to make this deal work. But Rouhani is saying, you need to speed up. Our people are dying as a result of the sanctions that are being put in place. You need to come to some way of dealing with this. Because the fact of the matter is, it's not Iran's fault. U.S. pulls out of the deal, bam. And they say, okay, we're going to dial back some provisions. And everybody's looking at them like, how dare you? We stayed within the deal for a year, Rouhani would say. Which is, they did. They stuck with the deal for a year after the United States pulled out of the deal. Meaning, despite the sanctions that the U.S. was ratcheting up, they stayed within the context of the deal. Rouhani has come across as measured and rational in this process. And he's doing so with a political opponent that is scary. I mean, look at this from their position for the moment. They're a country, and you already know that Iraq has taken place. And the irony of it is that the fact that Iraq has taken place is Iran's strongest bargaining chip. It's the strongest bargaining chip with Europe, but it's also its strongest bargaining chip with the United States itself. Meaning all of this, the specter of all of these negotiations that are taking place is Iraq. That havoc that had taken place, the million of Iraqis that have died, the 4,000 Americans, the $7 trillion in debt. But not just that, from the United States standpoint, from the Europe standpoint, because if you remember, the destabilization of Europe is a direct result of the war crime or the wars that took place in the Middle East. Those refugees that flooded, the right-wing nationalism that took place because of the immigrants that were coming into the country. That stuff was a result of the wars. Do you believe that the European leaders are unaware of that? They are not unaware of that. Which means that the last thing that they want is a war. Everybody in this process, the last thing they want is a war, with the exception of Bolton and so forth. But I don't think Trump necessarily wants a war. If I'm not mistaken, he's sending Rand Paul to be his envoy to some degree. The last news I heard on it. My point is this. With this kind of specter, there's a politics that's taken place where we're going to read the JCPOA as this in order to stay within the context of the JCPOA because we don't want a war. And Europe says the same thing. And so because neither side wants a war, they're allowing a certain degree of brinksmanship while simultaneously staying within the context of the JCPOA. It's politics. It's politics. Fucking love it. The last part to this is tit for tat. An aspect of this is tit for tat. It has to be. You can't necessarily allow the U.S. a certain degree of brinksmanship in this process. Now, the problem with this is it's warfare. It's information warfare, but it's warfare. Something takes place. The U.S. says it happened. Iran says it didn't happen. What's true? Who knows? At this point, they're in a conflict. And within the context of this conflict, both sides are trying to win. The truth matters less in this case. The propaganda that an organization or a country will put to its public is done so with the notion of forwarding certain objectives. All countries do it. All politicians do it. The same thing is taking place here, and the same thing takes place in the United States and in Iran. But because of such, truth matters less. So what's true is hard to know. You only get certain elements, but the reality of it is often something different. You often have to just kind of point yourself to, what do I want to take place in this situation, and kind of go with that as your kind of guiding force in this stuff. The tit for tat is one of those things that needs to take place, because I don't necessarily know another process of dealing with somebody in international issues where one side is being the aggressor. If one side is being the aggressor and believe they can just walk the table, then they're going to walk the table. There's a certain degree of politics in posturing. It just is what it is. It's somewhat human behavior. In this case, Iran shoots down a drone. That drone was flying in their airspace. They have the right to shoot down the drone. It is their legitimate right to do so, if indeed it was flying in their airspace. The U.S. says it wasn't. It was in international waters. Now, what's true? What is true is that Trump saves face by saying somebody was stupid, somebody messed up, because he understood that he had put himself into a corner where the press is asking him, are you going to have a strike with Iran that would have had unforeseen consequences? This is getting dangerous. But both sides are engaging in a certain degree of politics in order to keep themselves out of a war. But that only goes so far. And people can easily sleepwalk themselves into a war. The first time around, they did not expect to have a world war. It just escalated. All right, I'll leave this here. And by the way, the seizing of the tankers. They didn't hurt the crew. They didn't keep the crew. If they would have hurt or kept the crew, that would have been a whole different matter, and it would have escalated matters to such a degree that it would have caused a provocation in and of itself that would have had unforeseen consequences. Seizing the ship and letting it go is a pain in the ass. It's a nuisance. And it's not a nuisance, however, that you can go to war over. It's just a nuisance. It's politics. All of this is asymmetrical politics. Britain seizes their ship and keeps it. Iran seizes their ship, lets them go. Iran can't seize the ship and keep it because they don't have a power differential that would allow them to do such a thing. They can be a nuisance, however. Nobody wants a war. The brinksmanship in this case is that nobody wants a war. Ergo, Britain is not going to take a military option for the behavior that they're taking in this case. It's a nuisance. I hope that makes sense. The politics of this is fascinating because it's asymmetrical politics. Rouhani in Iran doesn't have the power in this sense, meaning the United States can destroy Iran, but it would create a specter worse than Iraq. That is not something that Trump wants to do, nor is it something that Europe wants to get behind. And it's also something that Iran doesn't necessarily want to take place. Iran can use that as somewhat of a leverage in negotiations in regards to aggression by the United States, meaning the U.S. is doing something that they did once before that created an outright crisis. Europe, are you going to be with us or with them on that? Like, it's fascinating politics that they're going through this, but dangerous politics, like brinksmanship. The first word in that is brink. It is literally using the specter of a war as a tool of negotiation. By the way, both sides are doing it. Trump is doing it from the threats that it's leveraging on Iran. And those threats go everything from what I suspect flying surveillance over their areas, may have even this notion of shooting down somebody's boat, like meaning they're blaming Iran for stuff in order to create a pretext to ratchet up tensions of this notion of having a pretext for attack. All of those things are threats. They're using the specter of Iraq, that threat of how bad it was, to go after them. But Iran is also using that specter in a sense of that's not something you want to do, nor are we going to lay down and let you walk over us. It is fascinating politics, but it is dangerous politics. Nobody watches these stories, but you wonder why I do these stories, because I think these stories are dramatically important. This is fascinating politics. But Robert McNamara, and I'll end it on this, opened my eyes to this, probably more than anybody else. Well, Chomsky and Zen, maybe Zen more than anybody else. But McNamara has this video where he starts talking about his conversation with Ho Chi Minh, meaning the Vietnam War, and the objectives that the U.S. wanted versus the objectives that Vietnamese wanted. And neither side understood the reality of the other side. Like he was bowled over. Like he said, they were to the point where they were going to almost go to blows, because he was like, you got 2 million, 2 million of you people died over this. And McNamara's point in this was, you need to understand what the other side is based in. The problem here, though, is that Trump doesn't care what the other side is based in. There's a certain hubris that's associated with being in that office. And I'm sorry. In this case, being racist, I think, plays into this. I've said it early on. That it plays into it. This notion of American exceptionalism. It's our divine right to tell you how you should run your country. Well, that's not, that's only in his head. Other countries don't accept that. Other countries they don't accept it. And I'll leave this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.